Welcome to our weekly study again, and we're so glad to have you with us. We have Marshall and Colton and Luke here, and myself, Stephen, as we continue our study through the book of Exodus. Tonight, we're picking up where we left off last week in chapter 4, and so Colton, why don't you talk about what we're going to be looking at this evening?
And so we're going to be going over the start of the relationship between Moses and Pharaoh, which is the basically 10 plagues that we are all familiar with, I believe, to some extent at least. And so as we go through these plagues, we're going to be taking a look at the progression of how things relate to one another concerning Moses and his work that he is trying to accomplish. And of course, if you we've been picking up from last week that you had that the people of Israel are in bondage in Egypt and that they have been enslaved for a good amount of time, and they are now being sent a deliverer. And this deliverer is the person of Moses. And so he was saved through his birth. He was saved out of Egypt in the first occurrence. And then he is sent back to Egypt. And we picked up, and we're going to be picking up today where we left off with the burning bush. And so the burning bush is God's call to now go back to Egypt and deliver your people, as I will be the one, God says, that will deliver them. And so we'll pick up on that idea here in just a moment. I do want to make mention of the fact that if you have any questions as we go through or any comments you want to add to the discussion, feel free to drop those in wherever it is that you're on, either Facebook or YouTube. And we'll do our best to try to address those. If we're unable to address those in the video, we'll make sure to come back to that later on. And if you're new, we'd love to know that you're here for the first time. So drop new in the comments, and we'd love to see that you're here for the first time. Before we get started, though, Luke, if you'll lead us in prayer.
Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day. We thank you for all the blessings that you have given to us. We thank you so much for the blessing of having your word in times of abundance and in times of need. We ask that you please be with all of us as we are studying through your word, to pour all of our attention onto it, help us be engrossed by it, even during this troubling time in our country and all over the world. God, there's so many things that go on, but we know that for those that are your disciples, those that are your people, your church, that you are our king, and with that we have an unshaken kingdom. God, we ask that you please help us to always remember these things, help us to always find confidence and strength in these things, and particularly when we are studying your word. God, please be with all of us who will be talking about your word tonight. Help us do so with ready minds, and help us to do so to your glory. And we ask all these things in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. All right, Marshall, you want to get us started?
Absolutely. So if you're following along in your Bible, we're going to pick up in the second part of chapter 4. We're going to be looking at chapter 4, beginning in verse 18 on through the end. And I'm going to break this into a couple of sections as we try to figure out what's going on just after the burning bush part of the story. And what we find here is that Moses has been commissioned. He's made the excuses, but now he is ready to move forward in the mission God has given to him. And so Moses goes to his father-in-law Jethro and asks that he and his family be allowed to return to Egypt. He says he wants to go and see how his brethren are doing, whether they are still alive. And this request echoes, but is far different than the last time we saw a Bible character asking his father-in-law if he can return to his people, that being Jacob and Laban. Jethro, the friend of God, has no hesitation. He says, you go, and you go check on your people. And at this point, God reassures Moses that the people who had been seeking his life are no longer doing so. It seems that this 40-year interim has allowed all those who had remembered the crime that Moses had done, they are no longer at issue for Moses. And so he is ready to return. And as Moses leaves Midian with his wife Zipporah and his sons Gershom and Eleazar, God instructs Moses further, and then he previews what he plans to do to Pharaoh and to Egypt. And he even specifically mentions here at the very beginning, even before any of the plagues, that there's going to be a final plague in which God kills the firstborn of the Egyptians. Now, as we think about this and some of the themes and applications of verses 18 through 23, what we find is that as Moses asks Jethro permission to leave, it is simply echoing an allegiance that Moses has had throughout this time. He aligns with his brethren, that is, with the Israelites, not with the Egyptians, not with the Midianites. The Hebrews are still his people. And this should remind us of the passage we looked at last week in Hebrews chapter 11, where he did not want to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter anymore, but he wanted to connect with his people and try to give them deliverance. Now, we've seen some of his reluctance up to this point, but now he is being pushed by God, as it were, to fulfill his mission. Something I find interesting as I read through this section is that the staff of Moses that we read about earlier, that shepherd's common shepherd staff, is now described as the staff of God. There's only two places in the Bible that exact phrase is used, the staff of God. It's here in verse number 20, where God is going to use that shepherd's staff that is now his staff to go on a war against Egypt. And then also in chapter 17 and verse number 9 of Exodus, where you have the staff of God being held up by Moses as they fight against the Amalekites. And so a lesson I learned from this is that God can take something simple and common, he can sanctify it and put it to his use. He can empower it. Now, we're not talking about physical things necessarily, though this is a physical thing, but in our lives, we may think something is common, some talent, some skill, some possession can't be used in the service of God, and yet he can take that and he can use it for good. And so we need to be willing to give everything to him and realize that he can make the common uncommon if it is used for his purposes. Now, in talking about that final plague, remember God foretells that the firstborn is going to be killed. Notice that God says he will kill the firstborn of Pharaoh because Israel is God's firstborn. And God is going to bring retribution upon Pharaoh for, in essence, killing or at least oppressing his son. Here you see the knowledge and the justice of God on full display. And yet Moses is the vessel that God is going to use to deliver this message. And so Moses needs boldness because his message is not politically correct. He is coming to the leader of the country and saying, you must let God's people go. And Moses has already shown that he's a bit timid. And so God is going to empower him to do the work that he needs. Now, for sake of time, I'm going to kind of move through very quickly surveying the rest of the chapter. You have this circumcision of seemingly Gershom. It just says the son of Moses. But you have this strange and abrupt episode that comes in at this point in which the family is going to Egypt and God is ready to kill Moses. Why? Seemingly because he has not circumcised his son, seemingly Gershom. That seems to fit because you have firstborn concepts all the way through. Zipporah immediately sees what the problem is, takes the flint, and she circumcises her son and casts the foreskin at Moses' feet, and that seems to be an atonement for Moses, as it were. And she says, you are a bridegroom of blood to me. Why is this story here? What does it mean? What can we apply from it? Well, there are a variety of interpretations regarding this story, but the themes of disobedience or maybe covenant unfaithfulness connected with judgment, connected with blood atonement, seem to indicate that this story, while it really did happen, is not merely to describe circumcision, but also to describe what God is going to do in and for Israel and also against Egypt. And some of the applications we could take from this story are that, one, details like circumcision actually matter to God. Number two, that leaders are held to a strict standard lest they fall victim to hypocrisy and pride. And three, God continues to work on individuals to increase their faithfulness. Now Moses is prepared. He has been sanctified, as it were, to be the leader. And as he comes before Aaron and the elders and Israel, Aaron and he meet at Mount Sinai. Aaron is prepared for a leadership role. They meet the elders and they perform the signs to inspire faith within them. And then Israel responds to the care of God with humility and worship. I just want to point out that the progression that you see here at the end of the chapter in the Old Testament is the same as that in the New Testament. God speaks a word, performs miracles to affirm that he is the source, and then good-hearted recipients will believe and worship him. And yet, while we see great hope for Israel at this point, we're going to see that very soon there's going to be some unbelief, and they're going to have to deal with that. And so that brings us to our next section. And so, Colton, do you want to talk about chapter 5?
Yeah, and so we have here the first meeting of Moses and Aaron with Pharaoh, and as we can expect, it does not go well. He has his first meeting, and in this first meeting, he says this reoccurring call from God through Moses, which is very familiar to us, let my people go. And this is the command of God to any captor of his people. That if his people have been brought into a form of captivity, he implores to the capturing nation. He informs them, "Let my people go," and that certainly is the case even with the New Testament. That you have that we are in captivity. You might consider Ephesians chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. But to each one of us, grace was given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore, it says, when he ascended on high, he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. And so in our redemption, we were in bondage to sin, the nation or the kingdom of Satan himself, and we had been drawn out of that we are captives that he has brought out of captivity. So this is a very common theme throughout the scriptures, this idea that even Moses says, let my people go. Now, obviously, since the plagues come later, Pharaoh does not take kindly to this command. And so his first argument against this is, who is Yahweh anyway? I don't know who he is. And even if I did know who he was, I'm certainly not going to let these people go. And that emphasizes how much Pharaoh is willing to lean on his own gods or even himself as a god of Egypt instead of any god that would be in a surrounding nation. So he says, why should I listen to Yahweh? And God's going to show him why he should listen to Yahweh as we go through. In this first meeting, there's not that full intervention by God himself that you see later on. But Pharaoh then goes about accusing them of being lazy, the Israelites. And so because they're lazy, in order to punish their laziness, he takes away their daily provision of straw that the Egyptians were to provide for them. And so when the Hebrew foremen were unable to achieve making the same amount of bricks, which was the command of Pharaoh, you're getting no straw, but you need to make the same amount of bricks. They cry out to Pharaoh and say, why is it that you are punishing us whenever it's your Egyptians that are not giving us what we need in order to make bricks? So they're quick to pass the blame, but that's even shown more clearly whenever Pharaoh says, it's your own fault that this is happening. You go and make these bricks just as you were before. After this point, they're quick to pass the blame not to the Egyptians, but to Moses himself, saying that Moses and Aaron are the ones to blame in this. And when they realized that it was coming straight from the top of Pharaoh himself and not just their oppressive captors that were over top of them, they are then quick to shy away from blaming Pharaoh or Egypt. And they say, Moses, it's your fault. You're the one that has caused this problem within our lives, and you're the one who needs to pay for that. Moses is going to show by the hand of God himself that this has nothing to do with Moses personally, but that God is ready to free them. So the very thing that they want is almost the very thing that they're rejecting. And they need to grasp onto it and accept what God is willing to give to them. Stephen, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah. So picking up there in verse 22 of chapter 5, Moses has questions for God, and we're going to see them here, and then we're going to see them later in chapter 6 again. And I think one of the things that we can see illustrated from these questions is that Moses is still growing as a leader, and he's still struggling. And so it's maybe some on-the-job training as it goes. His faith is still increasing. He says in verse 22, "O Lord, why have you brought harm to this people? Why did you ever send me? Ever since I came to Pharaoh to speak your name, he has done harm to this people, and you have not delivered your people at all." There's some frustration there. There's a lack of confidence there in Moses. And so, again, Moses has already expressed faith. Again, we've pointed out from the Hebrew writer, there was an expression of faith even at the very beginning. So he's got faith, but he has imperfect faith. He has faith that really has a ways to go yet. Not only does he have the lack of faith in regards to that, but in verse 12 of chapter 6, it says, "Behold, the sons of Israel have not listened to me. How then will Pharaoh listen to me? For I am unskilled in speech." We get down to the end of chapter 6. "Behold, I am unskilled in speech. How then will Pharaoh listen to me?" He's still struggling with the very things that he struggled with back in chapters 3 and 4 when he had that initial conversation with God, the call to go and to lead this people. And so I think this is not to throw Moses under the bus, as it were, but rather it's an encouragement to us to realize that God called a man who had a long way to go, and he came to the work not confident in his own abilities, not even confident and fully assured of God's part in that role. But there was enough to get started. There was enough for him to make movements, and so he's making movements, but still building the confidence. Well, God, in between that, in chapter 6, God responds to that outcry, that cry that says, just as Colton was saying, that this has made things worse. That's what the people are saying, and now that's what Moses is saying. And God says, wait on me. I am going to deliver these people. I will do it with an outstretched arm, he says. He says in verse 7, "Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians." And that is the covenant that he is going to continue to reiterate with the people. I'll be your God, and you will be my people. And so he reassures them of that here in this moment. There's a strange break beginning in chapter 6 and verse 14, where we go into genealogies. And I say it's strange, especially because, first of all, it's a very incomplete genealogy. It begins with Reuben and Simeon, and then picks up with Levi. And it's almost as if now we go down a rabbit trail with Levi, and we don't ever get to Judah and on through the rest of the sons of Jacob. But I think that if we remember, first of all, why Moses is writing this, or maybe when Moses is writing this is history being recorded. And this will be many years later. It's not at the moment, but Moses is reaching back and writing this. And not only that, but he's writing it to people who will read it for generations. And so as they're reading this part, they're going to need to know, who is this Moses? And let me tell you who this Moses is. And in fact, let's go ahead and look ahead a little bit, and let me tell you who this Aaron is that we're talking about. And so he starts sort of in an orderly way. Here's Reuben, here's Simeon, here's Levi, just kind of walking down through. Now let's pause at Levi and let me, it's like Levi falls into the order of the sons of Jacob, but then here's who Moses and Aaron are specifically. And their need for authority is being established here, I believe. Not only is Moses' authority being established, Aaron's authority is being established, and also the sons of Aaron and his grandsons' authority are being established here as we go through, because it takes on down. So as Moses would pass on, and even Aaron would pass on, and that priesthood would continue down through the sons of Aaron, already or they could reach back here, and that authority is being established as Moses is writing that history. So we might just make note of that. But then, as I say, he comes back to the question of how am I supposed to do this? I'm not the one that they're going to listen to. And so as we pick up in chapter 7, we see some of the ways that God helps to continue to establish Moses' confidence and his faith. And Luke, why don't you pick up there for us?
So in Exodus chapter 5, when Moses and Aaron first come before Pharaoh, as Colton was saying, Pharaoh first answers by saying, well, who is God? Who is this God of Israel that I should obey his voice? Well, when we get to chapter 7, we start to see just exactly why he will eventually obey the Lord, because this is the first. This is the chapter where the first plague is written, where we see the first plague, and I think it's interesting the way that chapter 7 starts, because God has already told Moses. He's already told Moses and Aaron what he's going to do. He's already previewed his plan on how he's going to deliver his people, and how Pharaoh is going to have a hard heart, how he's going to be stubborn, and how he's going to refuse him. And then in verse 4, it says, when Pharaoh does not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. Now, before we move on, these great judgments, again, as we're going to see in this chapter with this first plague, are these miracles, these 10 plagues to kind of get Israel, to free Israel from Egyptian bondage. I do think that it's important to note when God does this, when he previews his plan so often, because if you note that and you remember that, you see when that plan is fulfilled. And it's important to note that, because as you get to the end of this story, you're going to find that everything happened just the way that God said it did. And I think that there's encouragement that we can get from that. We can be built up when we do note these things. It's kind of like, even genealogies are important to note, because that name Levi is going to become pretty important when God starts introducing the law. But back to these plagues, these great judgments that God is going to send on Egypt to free his people, my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, he says in verse 4. As we talk about these plagues, I think one thing that's important to always remember is that these are miracles. And I feel like sometimes this kind of falls under the same category as the creation. Sometimes when we're talking about Genesis, when we're teaching through Genesis, and you guys didn't do this, but when some people are teaching Genesis and they talk about the creation, people try to explain some things away, especially when it comes to how many days it took for God to create everything. And people try to explain away, well, a day doesn't really mean a 24-hour day. Well, honestly, when it comes to God's word, I just want to take what he says. And what God says, that's what I'm going to believe, and that's what I'm going to teach. And I think that the plagues kind of fall under this. Sometimes some people might be tempted to try and explain these plagues away, but they're miracles. You can't explain them away naturally. They're not, they can't be physically and naturally explained. They're supernatural. And so I do think that's important to know as we're going to get into at least the first 9 plagues in this study tonight. And so verses 8 through 13, before we get to the first plague, Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh again, and God tells them that when Pharaoh asks, work a miracle for us, he tells them exactly what to do. And he tells them to throw that staff, just like before, throw it on the ground and it would become a snake. Now, after this happens, we see that Pharaoh talks to some of the wise men and the sorcerers and the magicians of Egypt. And your footnote might say the soothsayer priests of Egypt. And I think that name's important because it kind of indicates maybe some trickery there, as we're going to note in just a moment. But he talks to these magicians of Egypt, and it says that they did the same with their secret arts. So essentially, they created some snakes. Now, one question that someone might have when you're reading through this is, did the magicians actually do that? Well, I think there are arguments from either side whether they did or didn't. People will note that in Jesus' day, the devil had some power to possess people with demons. And so they note that to say, well, that maybe the magicians had some of that power. I'm not going to get into either argument. Ultimately, uh, even if they did have that power, ultimately, God showed his power to be greater, because it says that the staff that Aaron threw down, Aaron's staff, which became a snake, swallowed up all of the other snakes, all of the magician snakes. So no matter what, even if they did have that power, God still showed that he was more powerful. That this was the real deal, and we're going to see that uh, even more when, especially with these magicians. And I don't want to step on anybody's toes uh, for a future section, but the magicians are going to be the first people in Egypt to concede that these plagues are indeed the power of God. And so, again, you want to note these accounts as you're going through the Bible story. And so we finally get to the first plague. And many people are familiar with this, and they know that it is the water turning to blood. And so God tells Moses and Aaron to station themselves at the bank of the Nile and wait for Pharaoh. And when he comes, to put the staff over the Nile, and the waters become blood in Egypt. Now, again, what we see is the Pharaoh goes to his magicians, and the magicians kind of mimic somewhat the same thing. They turn some water into blood, seemingly. Again, either way, even if that was real, what they did, I think, again, we see that God's power is still shown as greater, because the magicians, the soothsayer priests, they couldn't mimic turning even the water that was in the vessels of the Egyptian households across the land into blood. So I do think that is important to note when it comes to that. But with this being the Nile, this river was very important for the Egyptians. This was the Egypt's uh, primary source of water. Because this area didn't really get that much rain. And so, being the primary source of water, what happens here is God turns what was a means of sustaining life. What he does is turn that into a river of death. Um, and so, even from the beginning, God hits pretty foundationally. He hits pretty hard from the beginning, just to show these people with these great judgments, to show them, to prove to them that I am the Lord, that I am the God of Israel, and I will deliver my people, as he says in the first few verses, as God says in the first few verses there. And as we continue on with the rest of the plagues, what we're going to see is that they just continue to hit foundational aspects of Egyptian life, and they're going to hit a lot of necessary provisions for Egypt. And we'll see that get more and more intense as we go. And it says in verse 25 that 7 days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. And then in chapter 8, we get to the second plague. So I believe Marshall had that.
Yeah. And so the next two plagues are going to be frogs and gnats, as it were. And God gives Pharaoh another chance to release Israel at this point. If, however, Pharaoh refuses, God promises to attack Egypt with frogs. In fact, it even uses a strong word. It says, I will smite Egypt with frogs. Now, Pharaoh obviously rejects the commandment of God. That's not explicitly stated, but God says, this is what you need to say. If Pharaoh refuses, send frogs. Well, the next thing you see is that they are sending frogs. So Aaron calls frogs out of the water to cover the land of Egypt. And the Egyptian magicians, as Luke pointed out, are able to, again, duplicate this miracle, as it were, making frogs come up from the land. But what's interesting, as Luke pointed out, is that they are unable to show the same kind of power that you get in the miracles of God. Whether these may have been illusions, but regardless, they cannot reverse the effects of the miracles. They can only somewhat duplicate on a smaller scale the miracles that God is performing. And a friend of mine wrote in a commentary, significantly, this is a quote, the magicians duplicated but did not reverse the plague, indicating the supreme power of Yahweh. The irony is obvious. Now, listen to this. Imagine a country is invaded and its citizens systematically help the invader destroy the country for the sole purpose of proving they are as powerful as he is. End quote. And so you've got them duplicating these miracles, which really is just bringing Egypt to its knees. And so God is working from all sides in order to show that he is the God of gods, that he is over all the Egyptian gods. Now, this plague of frogs distresses Pharaoh and obviously the rest of the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh begs Moses to entreat God that these frogs might be taken away. And Moses says, "When do you want me to entreat the Lord?" And he says, "Tomorrow." And Pharaoh says, "And if you do this, I'm going to release Israel afterward." Well, the frogs die, but the stench remains, and Pharaoh hardens his heart. Now, as you continue in this, you find that the plagues of the frogs may have been an attack on an Egyptian goddess named Heket. Now, there's some debate as to how much these specific plagues were against specific gods, but Heket was the first goddess of the Egyptian pantheon, and she is often represented in Egyptian literature or Egyptian iconography, but as a frog or as a woman with the head of a frog, and that was to symbolize fertility, because frogs were populating the Nile River, and they assumed that they saw that they laid a lot of eggs, assumed that there was very little pain in delivery, and so that represented what they wanted for the fertility of their land as well. But regardless of whether it is that specific god who is a goddess of fertility that God is attacking, it is disturbing the natural order of Egypt. And if you are interested at all in Egyptian history, you may have read a little word called Ma'at. And Ma'at is natural order. And the Pharaoh is personally responsible for maintaining Ma'at, maintaining natural order. Frogs invading the homes of Egyptians does not fit natural order. What's that say? It says God is bigger than Ma'at, Egyptian order. God is able to bring Egypt to its knees should it choose. So Pharaoh recognizes, I've got to do something to bring back this order. If that means releasing Israel, that's what I'll have to do. Just entreat God. But there's raises a question, why does he wait until the next day? Why does he say wait till tomorrow to entreat the Lord? Well, one may be that he was hoping that the calamity would go away and he wouldn't need the intervention of Yahweh, and so he wouldn't have to fulfill his part of the deal. Or it could be that he still doubts the power of Yahweh. Who is this Yahweh that I should obey him? Now, I see an application to prayer there. We can't fully develop it, but notice that he says, wait till tomorrow. Why? Maybe because he doesn't want God to owe God, or maybe he doesn't believe in the power of God. Do we ever doubt God in our prayer? Do we ever not make entreaties as we should? Well, the consequences of the disobedience linger, and they stink. The frogs are piled up, and it continues to affect the land of Egypt, continues to affect the natural order. And yet when they get relief, Pharaoh hardens his heart against the Lord. There's a lesson for us there too. When we get relief from the punishment, let's not forget the Lord. Now, the next plague seems to follow just after this, or very soon after this. In fact, you don't even see that Moses and Aaron really come to Pharaoh and make the same request. God says, bring this calamity upon them. And the plague is gnats. What are these gnats? Well, the Hebrew word is very nondescript. It just means small insects. And so some people assume it is lice. That's how the Syriac and the Targum translate this word from Hebrew. The Greek and Latin translations render it gnats, and most English translations do the same. But that same word is sometimes used of mosquitoes. So if you've ever hated mosquitoes, it could be the Egyptians were facing the same calamities that we do in the summer. And yet it's so much worse that they are covering the Egyptians. And here's where it gets interesting. The Egyptian magicians cannot reproduce this plague. They cannot do what God is doing. And they say, this is the finger of God. Now, Luke already pointed out the question of whether these are illusions or maybe demonic wonders. I probably lean toward illusions like Luke, but here's the point. God's power was evident in these miracles. These magicians couldn't reverse it. They could only somewhat duplicate it. And when it came to something they could not do, they said, this is the finger of God. If you want to study sometime, follow that word, that phrase, the finger of God. It's used about 4 times in the Bible. And the next time we're going to read about it is in Exodus chapter 31 and verse 18, where the very finger of God writes the law on the stone tablets. And then in the New Testament, where the very finger of God is casting out demons through Jesus. And so God's finger is able to perform mighty signs that no one else can duplicate. But the plagues are just going to get worse, showing that Yahweh is truly the God who is over all gods. So let's continue with plagues 4 and 5. And Colton, you got that?
Yeah, and so definitely the plagues are getting worse. However, if it were mosquitoes before, I'm not sure that flies are worse to me, but for some people. And so certainly the next one is swarms of flies. And I don't think we can overestimate how thick these swarms were. And it was not just like you're going to a picnic and you have to fly away some annoying little nuisances that get onto your sandwich. These things are everywhere, that they have entirely enveloped the area. And so imagine them in swarms over everything. And now we need to be clear, though. This is, I believe, the first time we see that there is a distinction, though. There is a distinction between where the flies go. And this begins to emphasize the idea of whose God this God is, because he makes an exception that only in Egypt will these flies be. And so when you went into the land of Goshen, when you went into the land of Israel, there were no flies. There were no swarms of flies. And so you can almost imagine that depending on how far Goshen was, how far you were from where the Egyptians were going or were, that you're looking off in the distance and there's just this black cloud in the distance, is how thick this would have looked. And it would have emphasized for the Israelites how great God is and how much he loves their people. But for the Egyptians, as they look off in the distance, as much as they can see through this thick cloud, all they see is clear skies in the land of Israel, and this would have emphasized to them judgment. Now, like the first plague, Pharaoh is warned about this at the river Nile. And so this should have been a warning sign: don't meet Moses at the river. And if he refuses to comply, God will send this plague. And so this is a direct action of God. Here you don't see an indication like you see in previous plagues that Moses or Aaron does something that God uses to start the plague, but instead what you see is that God is the instigator entirely of this plague by his own acts. Now, Pharaoh tries to bring a compromise, and this begins to be what Pharaoh tries to do in making things a little bit better for himself. He says, okay, you can go sacrifice, but sacrifice in Egypt. And Moses' reply is, you're not going to like that, because we're going to sacrifice in a way that the Egyptians are not pleased with. And if they see us sacrificing in this way, they're going to kill us. And so that's just not an option. And so Pharaoh brings another compromise. You can sacrifice, but don't go too far. And he's trying to keep them as close as possible. And Moses doesn't even give a reply to this. But instead, he just says, I'll make supplication to God for you. Don't mess it up like you did before. Listen to God. Let us go. Which Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused once again. Now, in response to Pharaoh's stubbornness, God sent another plague, a pestilence, that wiped through all the livestock in Egypt. And once again, it makes very clear there is a distinction that only the livestock of the Egyptians were plagued by this, and not the livestock of the Israelites. So God literally has set apart his people, which emphasizes what he wants his people to be once they come out of Egypt, which is holy. And so God only is willing to harm the livestock of the Egyptians. Now, seemingly out of hatred for Yahweh, Pharaoh refused again. And we're only halfway through the plagues. And so, as Marshall emphasized, it's going to get much worse. Stephen, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, so coming into chapter 9 and verse 8, there's, what we have is some displays in each of these cases. And I think as you look at these displays, God wants to make it clear who is bringing the plagues. And it's Moses, it's God through Moses. Moses is his instrument to bring these plagues. And so he throws dust into the air. The dust becomes fine and it scatters throughout the land and it becomes boils on the people. Up to this point, the health of the people has not been touched. And so, like the story of Job, where he loses a great many possessions, but he still has his health. Now it's getting closer to home, you might say. And so the people are struck. It also makes a point here to say that the Egyptians, they're magicians now, they can't even come before Pharaoh. You see a progression of their impotence. What you might see as some power in the beginning, even that is farcical, as Marshall pointed out how powerless it is to say, well, I can't stop this, but I could make it worse. And then from that to we can't even reproduce this to now we can't even get out of our beds. And so it's like God has pushed them further and further away and really attacking all the confidences of Pharaoh. There are several gods having to do with health and well-being that might fall into the category of being specifically attacked, perhaps. But at any rate, after this plague, then God gives another warning to Pharaoh. And it is that these last three plagues are going to be worse than all the ones that have come before it. That there's going to be increasing intensity as we move forward. And so the next plague is that of hail. And it's not normal hail. It is very destructive hail. And it also comes with fire. And so can you imagine, when I was younger, the only hail we ever saw, I ever saw growing up was very tiny sized hail. But over the years, and especially as the internet allows us to see hail from all over the world, I've seen some that would catch your attention and make you think judgment is coming. Some very scary looking images, but then add to that the other elements, and then add to that here, now we have a natural phenomenon, hail, raining down from the sky, but only on the Egyptians. No property damage right over there. Too much for coincidence. Again, gods of storm, gods of the sky, gods of crop protection and so forth. After the crops are damaged by this hail, along with all the rest of their property, then comes another wave of crop damage because we have the locusts that come in. And it says that they sort of clean up what's left by the damage from the hail. And so God is wiping out. Again, for us, it's hard for us. We're only getting a taste of the notion of our food supply lines being damaged in the last couple of months. We hardly feel the effects when there's bad weather. We've done so much to mitigate that in the way that we grow our food and so forth. Can you imagine, starting from the beginning, as Luke said, their source of life in the Nile, now at this point, everything is wiped out. And everything that they would use to get back online is gone. And so these people are utterly devastated. The nation would have been brought to its knees. But there's something that gets said here in verse 20. It says in chapter 10 and verse 20, the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not let the sons of Israel go. Now back in chapter 5 and also in chapter 6, God said that he would harden Pharaoh's heart. And beginning in chapter 7, we have a series of the sort of bringing that about, it says, beginning in chapter 7 and verse 3, I will harden the Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But then looking over in verse 22, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened. Looking over in chapter 8 and verse 15, it says, when there was relief, he, that is Pharaoh, hardened his heart and did not listen to them. Over in chapter 9 and in verse 34, again, it says, but when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. And then finally in chapter 10 and verse 20 now, it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. You see, there's a real mixture here of who's doing the hardening of the heart. And I think this is an important point for us to note. In Romans chapter 9, there in verses 17 and 18, Pharaoh is used as an example of someone who God used for his purposes. He says he hardened Pharaoh's heart. And of course, in that context, Israel is being challenged because they don't have a problem with God using Pharaoh that way. They have a problem with God using them that way, but not with Pharaoh. And I think the other thing that you note in that context is that he points to the potter. And the clay will not say to the potter, why have you made me this way? And some people take that and Pharaoh, the story here, to mean that what God does is decides who's going to be good and who's going to be bad, he's going to make some bad people and then use them, make some good people and use them. But rather, if you trace the language, for instance, of the potter back to Jeremiah chapter 18, you'll see there in Jeremiah 18 and beginning in verse 1, God tells Jeremiah to go down to the potter's house. And he's got some clay. And what he wants to do with that clay is make something good, like any potter would, make a honorable vessel. But the clay is marred in his hands. The clay won't be made into an honorable vessel. So he says, well, I can make a dishonorable vessel out of this clay. And so he does that. And then he goes on and says, so it is with nations. And if God says, I will bring calamity, but they repent, then he will change. If he says he will bring blessing, but they practice wickedness, then he will change. And so it is here with God. God says, I'll harden Pharaoh's heart. Well, Pharaoh has an option, just as when God says, I'll bring destruction. Pharaoh has an option to submit to that hardening. And someone says, God needs his heart to be hard. What God wanted accomplished was his glorification. And if Moses had marched in there and said, let my people go, and Pharaoh had bowed down to the God of heaven and said, absolutely, I will honor God and I will honor his people, God's role still would have been accomplished. And so God doesn't lose anything if Pharaoh chooses the other direction. But God knows Pharaoh. God knows what kind of man Pharaoh is. And we see that play out because all along it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. And so what God used was the kind of man that this was, and he gave him opportunities that a man who didn't already have a hard heart might have surrendered much sooner. But Pharaoh has a hard heart, and it gets harder and harder. And so we see that God offering these things, he knows what to give to Pharaoh to make him even more hard and more hard, so that he will have the full opportunity to show who he is. So I think we need to appreciate that kind of progression there through there to understand how God uses men and how God used Pharaoh in this particular instance. Well, that brings us to the last couple of plagues here. And so, Luke, why don't you take us through the rest of the story there, through the rest of chapter 10.
Yeah, I really appreciated that point. Thank you for making that point about the hardening there. So we get to chapter 10, and we get to the 8th and the 9th plague. We won't be talking about the 10th plague until the next study, but we get to the 8th and 9th plague. And there's a couple things that I just want to bring out in these last two plagues that we'll be talking about tonight. So Moses and Aaron come before Pharaoh once again, and they warn him once again that he needs to humble himself before God, and he needs to let God's people go. He tells Pharaoh that he's going to send locusts and they're going to cover the land. And in verse 5, it says that they will also eat the rest of what has escaped, what is left from the hail. So everything that was even left from the hail, he says the locusts are going to come in and they're going to take the rest of it. And so again, you just see the destruction increasing more and more with each plague. And you are going to see that progression up to that final plague. And it's interesting because after they warn Pharaoh, after Moses and Aaron warn Pharaoh, they leave. And in verse 7, Pharaoh's servants actually come to him and they say to him, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Do you not realize that Egypt is destroyed?" Now, we're going to make a point about that in just a second. But very quickly, Pharaoh, I think, takes their advice here, and he summons Moses and Aaron once again, and he tells them that they can go and serve their God. He asks them which ones they're going to take with them as they are going to serve God, and Moses says that they need to take everyone. And Pharaoh says, "You can't do that." He doesn't like that, and he says in verse 10, "Thus may the Lord be with you if ever I let you and your little ones go. Take heed, for evil is in your mind. Not so, go now, the men among you, and serve the Lord, for that is what you desire." So they were driven out from Pharaoh's presence. And after this, God indeed sends the plague of the locusts, and they bring just as much destruction as he said they would. In verse 14, it says, "The locusts came up over all the land of Egypt and settled in all the territory of Egypt. They were very numerous. There had never been so many locusts, nor would there be so many again." And so they come and bring that destruction. Pharaoh, it says, hurriedly called for Moses and Aaron to plead for him to God, and he asked to please forgive my sin only this once. And they do, and they make the supplication to the Lord. And as soon as the locusts leave, Pharaoh breaks his promise again. And then we get to the 9th plague. And I just want to go through this very quickly so then we can make just a couple points of application. In verse 21 through the end of the chapter, we get to the 9th plague, which is the plague of darkness. And this one, it seems, comes without warning. And I say without warning, but really, this whole time, God has been telling Pharaoh and telling Egypt what he is going to do. And just kind of like what Stephen was saying just a moment ago, this could have gone another way. They could have still glorified God by choosing to just submit to him and humble themselves. But the plague of darkness comes, and it says in verse 21 that it was a darkness which may be felt. And so that's pretty impressive, especially when you think about in verse 23 when it says that they did not see one another, nor did anyone rise from his place for 3 days, but all the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. And then it says in verse 20, it says through the rest of the chapter that Pharaoh asks for them to well, let me see here. In verse 26, "Therefore our livestock too shall go with us. Not a hoof shall be left behind, for we shall take some of them to serve the Lord our God. And until we arrive there, we ourselves do not know with what we shall serve the Lord." But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. And he essentially says, "If I ever see you again, I'm going to kill you." And Moses says, "You're right. I shall never see your face again." And so, going back to the 8th plague, the plague of the locusts, one thing that I want to note about the servants coming to Pharaoh and saying, "How long will this man be a snare to us?" Look at all the people, all of the advisors of Pharaoh who have now kind of gone in the direction of God's choice. First, the magicians say that this is the finger of God. And at this point, we don't even hear from the magicians again. And then you get to the servants, and we get to this 8th plague, and it seems that they want Pharaoh to go ahead and humble himself before the Lord and let the people go. And so I think that that's important to know as we go through the storyline, just seeing how much everyone is starting to realize, other than Pharaoh, that they need to adhere to God's rules and adhere to his command, them being the ones advocating for the release of Israel. And then we get to the 9th plague. And what I think we can say about both of these plagues, again, just reiterating what I said earlier, that these were indeed miracles. It's too much of a coincidence when you see in verse 23, kind of like what Stephen said just a moment ago, that these plagues were isolated to Egypt, at least most of them. And especially with this darkness, darkness and light. In Birmingham, Alabama, they're going to have the same darkness that Athens, Alabama has, and you have to share light and darkness. But here we see that it's not shared. So it's clear that this is a supernatural event that God brought about and isolated Egypt in the darkness and gave light to his own people. And so again, I think that reiterates the point that these were miracles, and you can't explain these away through natural causes. But very quickly, the final point of application I want to make is in all of these plagues, I think one thing that we find is mercy. Just in the fact that God, he never had to warn these people. He never had to give them all of these chances. You think 10 plagues? 10 plagues? I don't think we would ever give people that many chances. Often we don't. We tend to not give people that many chances. Usually it's one chance, and after that, no more. And so I think in all of this, we do see judgment, and we see the wrath of God on his enemies and the enemies of his people. But we also see that love in mercy, the fact that he could have destroyed them, as he says with the hail in chapter 9, but he hasn't yet. And he will continue to bring plagues on them to have his will be done. And we'll see that especially in the last plague, in the Passover. And Marshall, I think you were talking about what we'll be talking about next.
Well, real quick, are there any questions that anyone wanted to bring out or comments that are seen on your side? We're clear on this side, but just wanted to give that opportunity.
Same here.
Clear here too.
All right. Yeah, as Luke said, Marshall's going to let us know what we're going to be taking a look at for next week.
Yeah. And so we are going to finish look at the final plague next week, and then we're going to track all the way through to Exodus chapter 18. So if you want to read ahead, we're going to be looking at Exodus 11 through 18. In that, we're going to be looking at the Passover. We're going to look at the deliverance at the Red Sea. We're going to see God's providence in the wilderness, and then as some of the events just before they get to Mount Sinai. So we've got some big story events, some things that a lot of us who have been Christians for any amount of time have heard these stories. We're going to see how they fit into the story thus far, and then how they fit with the rest of the Bible, specifically in the New Testament. So we hope you'll come back next week as we continue this story. Again, read Exodus 11 through 18. Thank you for all the comments. And if you have any comments or questions afterward, just send us a private message either to any of us personally or to Westlake, Stone Canyon, Pepper Road. We'll be happy to try to answer any questions that you might have or direct you to the right place in your Bible. Again, thank you all for being here. And if there's no other questions or comments from anybody, we'll close out our study. Thank you again.